Welcome back to How China Works.
On today's show, we're going to talk all about the generational differences between China and the West, specifically focused on millennials.
We thought it made the most sense to look at this generation in particular for several reasons. One is that, of course, I am one, and therefore we have special insights into them.
And I'm a Gen Xer myself, which is the generation before yours, of course, the generation that is poised to take over the top positions of power around the world currently, although I don't think I'm part of that, but not all kinds of power. Many of the most successful companies, especially in tech and new media, are actually run by the older millennials.
Facebook, of course, is one example, but this is a little more true in the West than in China. Lots of our leading tech companies are run by people your generation or even older. This reflects the relative growth timelines of our two economies and the opportunities created as a result, etc.
We'll also hear from one of our favorite unpaid and unofficial guest resources on the show. You know him and you probably love him, folks. Get ready to hear more from...
Confucius?
No, Jack Ma. I think he's slightly more relevant to today's youth, you dig?
I think so. Let's find out.
To get us started, let's define what millennial even means. This is a special intergenerational term, technically referring to the millennial generation or Gen Y. They were roughly born between 1982 and 2000. There is not universal consensus on what dates define this or any other recent generation, by the way. You can look this up for yourself and you won't find two sources that are in total agreement, but this is close enough for a 15-minute podcast.
In terms of size, the Chinese millennial population in particular is pretty huge. It represents 415 million people, which is about 5 times bigger than the same cohort in the United States.
And of course, your country is only about 3.5 times bigger than the U.S. in terms of population, so the growth of the millennial generation in particular here is really outstripping mine back home. For today's show, we're mostly going to talk about the Chinese version of Gen Y, but we'll interject some statistics about their Western counterparts as appropriate. To get us started though, YINGYING, please tell us some of the characteristics of Chinese millennials like yourself.
Well, first, their mind is more open than any previous generation. Second, the experience of going from poverty to wealth makes them much more willing to struggle to get ahead. Third, they will not be working in manufacturing like the older generations did. They are interested in innovation. And fourth, they are a proud generation because they have witnessed their country get rid of poverty at a speed and scale that has never been seen before in human history.
That is all impressive and or incredible. And it goes a long way towards explaining the pride and attitude that many of them exhibit. They're also the first generation here in China that grew up in a time of relative peace and stability. They came of age under a market economy, although with Chinese characteristics. The old mercantile system mindset still affects things here today in various ways, as we've talked about in previous shows. But in practical terms, it's mostly been replaced by the much more modern one. And perhaps most importantly, Chinese millennials' own growth and development has been in sync with the evolution of the internet and computer science age, which means that it's second nature to them to use digital means and technology in every aspect of their lives. But of course, along with the bright side comes the downside, as it always does, and they have some pretty unique challenges as well.
This is very true. I think of this generation as also being a very hard generation. Remember that norms around the marriage and creating a family at a young age are much different than in the West. Many people of my generation here are not only focused on getting married and having children of their own, they are also dealing with the realities caring for aging parents who also expect their support.
Right, they have to think about things such as buying houses and taking care of education for their own young families, and on medical care and housing issues related to their parents too. Even if they're fortunate and their parents are relatively well off and don't need direct financial support, there's still the emotional bonds of filial piety that command them to be more involved in each other's lives, leaving less time for their children and their spouses and, of course, themselves than their friends in the West.
The bottom line, though, is that they are changing the country more dramatically than any other generation. They will be the core of China's whole society in the next 5 years, and the fate of the country will be heavily dependent on them. And of course, this is all happening at a time when China is rising in the world, and therefore Chinese millennials will have an even deeper impact globally.
Jack Ma had some pretty smart thoughts, as he often does, on this very topic. Uncle Jack said that understanding young people in China is the key to understanding the future of Chinese business. Of course, this impacts pretty much every sector imaginable, but for the sake of finishing the show at some point today, we'll just look at two of them.
The first one involves the buying of luxury goods. By 2016, the internet penetration in China had exceeded 50% of the country, with mobile phone netizens accounting for more than 90% of that traffic. Of those, 30% of them are millennials. It's also helpful to note that mobile phone penetration is over 90% among this group too.
Former presidential candidate Mitt Romney's old company, Bain, publishes research from time to time, and they concluded that China's wealthy millennials are especially attracted to the concepts of newness and speed. They're well-educated, fashion-oriented, and complex in their tastes. The millennials, not Mitt Romney himself, although I'd pay him to take over right about now. Chinese millennials started shopping at a younger age and are more inclined to buy luxury goods than people my age. Go figure. Anyway, according to this survey, they bought an average of 8 luxury items in 2017, the highest number of any demographic. Now, because this is a fickle consumer who likes shiny new things, this means that luxury brands have to fight to stay fresh and introduce new products constantly. It also helps that they don't, trash Chinese culture in the process. I'm looking at you, D&G.
The way that Chinese millennials get their information is also changing rapidly. The various online channels are the primary source of news for them, while KOLs on social media help to set the fashion trends. KOLs play a very big role in not only helping consumers to create a ready-made style that works, it can help them become fashionable in their own right, and they mix and match items and use their own taste to make something new.
In music, they call that a mashup. I'd like to hear a combination of traditional Mongolian folk music and death metal band Slayer myself.
And I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Okay.
So moving on, I'll say that more and more luxury brands believe that Chinese consumers are creating luxury trends. First, they represent 32% of total global luxury consumption. Many Chinese fashion KOLs and youth-oriented media are becoming authorities of luxury consumption. China embodies the concept of digital marketing and e-commerce.
You also pointed out a product to me last week that's pretty interesting and I understand is taking the country by storm.
Yes, there's also a phenomenon that Chinese millennials generation of consumers are increasingly acknowledging national brands. Recently, there has been a trend in the consumer sector to embrace national brands, such as the Forbidden City brand lipsticks you just mentioned.
Yeah, they're in a color palette that reflects the traditional palace design scheme, and they sell for the same price as Dior. Crazy.
They look very high-end for sure. My friends are all saying, shut up and take my money. The bigger point is that these national brands are reflecting local taste while utilizing internet culture to become a viral brands overnight, as with that makeup line.
Shifting gears a bit, there's also a shift in priorities about whether or not to make buying a house as big a priority in consumption as it was for previous generations.
Yes, this is a big concern. I have one friend in particular I'm thinking of who works at a major tech company. He's just a few years older than me, in his early 30s. And although he has a good job and makes very healthy salary, he also has a house payment that takes up the majority of his income. In his area, housing prices are actually falling, so it's not advantageous to sell, even if he wanted to. Plus, there's cultural mandates about owning a home that makes socially desirable for him to have one, even if it is not financially convenient. And there are plenty of more people in exactly his scenario right now.
On this topic, we're going to paraphrase Jack Ma again, who's advised young people not to buy a house necessarily. He essentially made the point that there's only so much you can fight for at a given time. For most people, that comes down to whether they fight to buy a home or for some other kind of dream. If someone fresh out of college decides to buy a house, they'll become a slave to it and most likely give up on their dreams just to afford their lifestyle. However, if they instead devote the same amount of attention and resources to building a business, for instance, or pursuing some other dream, in 10 years they'll likely be able to afford an entirely different reality. This reminds me of something I'll talk about in a moment regarding Western millennials, but there's one more Jack Ma idea that's relevant here.
Right. He also pointed out that technology is making trade more comprehensive and more global. Young people are using their mobile phones to buy global goods, international service, and logistics. In the future, small business will possibly be even more viable than today, as long as they are plugged into a good third-party ordering and distribution infrastructure. Technology is going to allow people to create more healthy, dynamic, innovative small business. So Jack Ma encouraged people to pay special attention to younger people around 30 years old, because over the next 30 years, they're going to change the world.
And at the risk of becoming the Jackpot Radio Hour here, I'll mention one last point he stressed regarding how financial institutions should support youth ventures. There's enormous future opportunity in servicing the needs of small businesses, young people, and developing countries. If you're looking for an undertapped sector to invest your time and resources in, you could do worse than starting there.
Before we wrap it up, let's have a brief check-in on my counterparts in the United States. What does the data say about millennial habits in living, shopping, and general attitudes where you're from, Brendan?
Well, as you just said, there's an enormous amount of things we could look at, so this topic could have its own show. But to stay consistent with what we've been discussing so far, let's look at Western millennials' attitudes about housing. A lot's been written about how statistically U.S. millennials are turning away from purchasing homes more than any other recent generation before them, and this is due to a number of factors. One of the most commonly cited is a fundamentally different attitude towards ownership as a concept in general, and a more open approach to romantic relationships, if you can call the hookup culture romantic, so they don't need to buy and build for large families of their own. But more importantly, they prefer an urban lifestyle. They don't want a giant home in the suburbs with a yard and a roof that's going to leak at some point and a driveway that'll need to be sealed or raked or shoveled, etc.
Wow, I get it. They've grown up and come of age with internet like me. They like the cars on demand instead of in garage that they have to pay rent insurance for.
Exactly. But the second factor is, of course, the financial one. There's countless statistics about youth unemployment, extraordinary student loan debt, and so on, which paint a very bleak picture about the prospects of my younger friends back home. U.S. millennials are the largest generation there, with 75 million of them, but the median age of home ownership is 57 years old, which obviously ain't them, right? Only 14% of them own homes, 50% rent, and guess where the other ones live? That's the last 1/3.
Where?
At home with their parents.
Wow, double wow.
Yeah, right?
Really?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
For real.
Then shifting back to China, let me leave you with this thought. It's imperative for international brands that have Chinese ambitions to acquire deep insights across various demographics they intend to sell to and understand what truly drives purchase decisions. This also creates an opportunity for Chinese brands to better understand the customer behavior of other markets, so they can learn how to bring a different experience home and improve their own market share even further.
Words to live by. Thanks, YINGYING. As we go, YINGYING is going to mention 2 examples of how youth organizations here are working to help millennials.
Yes, just this past weekend, I was honored to be a panelist at an event organized by Scholar, a Shanghai-based platform bringing together millennials leaders from 18 countries. They had an event called Ahora Scholar Vision that focused on the state of youth entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it looked like a great event. I wish I could have gone.
It was. It is important for Chinese youth to be together and collaborate, and this event helped us do that with colleagues from around the world. We have this concept here called 抱团取暖, which actually means to be with each other together, hugging each other in a group to stay warm. Practically speaking, this refers to the tendency to help friends, your friends, in times of challenges and to share your value and values among each other.
There's also another group called Polaris Youth, or YESCO,
北辰青年
that means young entrepreneurs and students going out in English. It helps Chinese millennials embrace entrepreneurship in a warm, brave, and effective way.
So there are a lot of resources to choose from if you are in this category, and it can serve as an inspiration for anyone who wants to get involved and support such an organization.
Indeed. All right, it's been a big day for us here. I'm Brendan Davis.
And I am YINGYING. See you tomorrow for more about Chinese millennials on how China works.